On October 24, 1960, at a Soviet rocket facility in the Kazakhstan desert, somewhere between 92 and 126 people burned alive. The rocket fuel was so toxic it had a nickname among the engineers who worked with it: Devil's Venom. When the missile exploded on the launch pad, those closest to it were vaporized instantly. Those further away caught fire. Some jumped into underground blast shelters to escape the flames and were found hours later, asphyxiated by the fumes that followed them in. The Soviet government knew about every single death within hours, and then they made all of it disappear. The official state newspaper Pravda reported the following week that Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, the commander of the Soviet strategic rocket forces, who had been standing near the launch pad, had died in an airplane crash. His funeral was held in Red Square. His obituary mentioned nothing about a rocket, nothing about a fire, nothing about the more than 100 people who burned alongside him. The truth stayed buried for 29 years. But the Nedelin catastrophe was not the only disaster the Soviet Union erased. It was not even the most disturbing one, because 3 months later, something happened in a small room in Moscow that the Soviets would hide from the world for nearly 2 decades, something that, had it been known at the time, might have saved the lives of 3 American astronauts. This is the story of the Soviet space disasters they tried to make disappear, and the human cost of the silence that followed.
To understand why the Nedelin catastrophe happened, you need to understand the pressure the Soviet space and missile program was under in October 1960. Nikita Khrushchev had just given a speech to the United Nations boasting that the Soviet Union was producing rockets like sausages from a machine. The R-16, a second-generation intercontinental ballistic missile capable of delivering a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world, was supposed to be the proof. Its first test launch was scheduled for October 24th. Senior officials from Moscow had traveled to Baikonur Cosmodrome to watch. 30 minutes before the planned launch, the countdown was halted. Engineers detected problems with the missile's fuel system. Standard safety procedure was clear: drain the fuel, clear the area, investigate the fault with the missile in a safe, unfueled state. Marshal Nedelin ordered everyone to stay. He reportedly said, "Am I not an officer just like the rest of you?" Around 150 personnel remained on and around the launch pad. Technicians worked directly on the fully fueled missile. At some point, accounts differ on exactly what triggered it, a technician connected an umbilical cable incorrectly, sending a command signal to the second stage engine. The second stage ignited while the rocket was still on the launch pad. Within seconds, the first stage fuel tanks ruptured and exploded. The blast was visible for miles. People on the launch gantry were engulfed in burning propellant. Those who ran were chased by rivers of liquid fire. Those who jumped into the blast shelters below the pad found the noxious fumes had followed them. The designer Mikhail Yongel survived only because he had stepped into a fireproof hut moments earlier to smoke a cigarette. He spent years saying that cigarette saved his life. When investigators arrived the next morning, the only physical evidence that Marshal Nedelin had been there was a single pin, his military decoration, found in the ash near where he had been standing. The Soviet government launched an investigation led by Leonid Brezhnev, who would later become the USSR's leader, and then classified every finding at the highest level. Families of the dead were told their husbands and sons had died in accidents. Some were told airplane crashes. Some were given no explanation at all. A mass grave was dug in a park in the nearby city of Leninsk. 54 name plaques were placed on a memorial obelisk, but investigators later estimated the death toll was closer to 126, meaning dozens of victims were not even publicly acknowledged to exist. It was not until 1989, under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost or openness, that the Soviet Union officially acknowledged the Nedelin catastrophe for the first time, 29 years after it happened. By then, most of the witnesses were elderly. Many were dead. The truth had been buried with them. On March 23, 1961, 20 days before Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, a 24-year-old cosmonaut trainee named Valentin Bondarenko was sitting inside a sealed pressure chamber in Moscow. He was the youngest member of the Soviet Union's first cosmonaut group. His fellow trainees called him Valentin Jr. He was known as mild-mannered, good-humored, a fine singer, and excellent table tennis player. He had a wife named Anya and a 5-year-old son named Sasha. He had been selected from thousands of candidates to be among the first humans trained for spaceflight. The chamber he was sitting in was filled with a pure oxygen atmosphere, mimicking the environment inside a Soviet spacecraft. He had been inside for 10 days as part of an endurance experiment.
On the 10th day, at the end of a routine session, he removed the biosensor pads attached to his skin, cleaned the adhesive marks with a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, and without thinking dropped the cotton ball onto a small electric hot plate he had been using to brew tea. In a pure oxygen atmosphere, even a small flame does not behave like a normal fire. It does not flicker. It does not spread slowly. It erupts. Bondarenko's clothing caught immediately. He tried to smother the flames with his sleeve. His sleeve caught. The entire chamber was engulfed within seconds. Because of the pressure difference between the chamber and the outside air, the attending doctor could not open the door for nearly 30 minutes. When he finally got inside, Bondarenko was still alive but barely recognizable. His burns covered almost his entire body. The attending surgeon at Botkin Hospital wrote later that the only blood vessels intact enough to insert a needle were on the soles of his feet, the only part of him his flight boots had protected. Yuri Gagarin, whose own historic flight into space was 3 weeks away, sat at the hospital as the designated watch officer through the night. Bondarenko died 16 hours after the accident. The Soviet government classified the death immediately. Bondarenko's name was removed from official photographs of the Cosmonaut group. In images where he had stood among his fellow trainees, the spot where he stood was doctored, sometimes simply blurred, sometimes filled with invented background detail. His widow was given a job at the Cosmonaut facility under undisclosed terms. His son grew up knowing his father had died, but not how or why. The cover-up held for 19 years. In 1980, details of the incident finally leaked to researchers in the West. In 1986, a Soviet journalist named Yaroslav Golovanov published the full account in the newspaper Izvestia, the first time Soviet citizens had ever read the name Valentin Bondarenko in print. But here is the detail that transforms this story from a tragedy into something more disturbing. 6 years after Bondarenko died in an oxygen-rich chamber fire, 3 American astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died in an almost identical accident during a ground test of the Apollo 1 spacecraft. A spark in a pure oxygen atmosphere, a fire that could not be stopped, 3 men who could not get out. The Apollo 1 fire happened on January 27, 1967. Had the Soviet Union disclosed what happened to Bondarenko in 1961, NASA engineers designing the Apollo spacecraft atmosphere would have known that pure oxygen environments on the ground were catastrophically dangerous. They had 6 years to learn that lesson from the Soviet tragedy. Those 6 years of secrecy may have cost 3 American astronauts their lives, not through malice, through silence, the most expensive silence in the history of the space race.
By April 1967, the Soviet space program was under the same kind of pressure that had created the Nedelin catastrophe 7 years earlier. The Americans were closing the gap. Soviet leadership wanted a dramatic space spectacular to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Soyuz 1 spacecraft had problems, serious ones. Engineers had submitted a written report to Soviet leadership listing 203 structural faults with the vehicle. The report was ignored. The launch was ordered to proceed. Vladimir Komarov was assigned as the pilot. He knew the spacecraft was not ready. According to accounts from people close to him, he also knew that if he refused the mission, the backup pilot, his close friend Yuri Gagarin, would be sent instead. He reportedly told a friend before the launch that he was going to die, but he could not let them send Gagarin. Soyuz 1 launched on April 23, 1967. Almost immediately, problems cascaded. One of the solar panels failed to deploy, cutting the spacecraft's power in half. Attitude control systems malfunctioned. The vehicle tumbled. Komarov fought the controls for hour after hour as Soviet ground controllers scrambled for solutions. After 19 orbits, the decision was made to bring him home early. During re-entry, the parachutes that were supposed to slow the capsule's descent became tangled. The backup parachute also failed. Soyuz 1 struck the ground at roughly 90 miles per hour. The capsule caught fire on impact. By the time recovery teams reached the site, Komarov's remains had been almost completely incinerated. He was identified from a fragment of a heel bone. The Soviet Union announced his death publicly. There was no hiding this one. Komarov received a state funeral. His ashes were interred in the Kremlin Law. He was declared a hero of the Soviet Union. But what the Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged was that the spacecraft had been known to be unsafe before launch, that engineers had begged for the flight to be delayed, that the political pressure to launch on schedule had been the direct cause of Komarov's death. The official account praised his courage. It said nothing about the 203 documented faults, nothing about the warnings that were ignored, nothing about the decision to send a man into space on a vehicle that its own engineers had pleaded not to fly. That version of the story, the one about institutional pressure overriding engineering judgment, stayed buried until researchers began publishing in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and some of its archives began to open. By then, Komarov had been a hero for nearly 30 years. The truth about why he died had been a secret for almost as long. The Nedelin catastrophe, Bondarenko's death, and Komarov's mission were not the only things the Soviet space program tried to hide. There was a systematic pattern of erasure that extended to the people themselves. When cosmonauts were removed from the program, for disciplinary reasons, medical failures, or political problems, they were removed from history as well. Official photographs of the first cosmonaut group were systematically altered. James Ober, an American journalist who spent years researching Soviet space history, tracked down original and doctored versions of the same images and found that at least 5 people had been removed from a single group photograph. In some cases, the doctoring was so clumsy that obvious visual artifacts remained: patches of wall where a person had been, shadows with no source, perspectives that did not match. One of those deleted figures was Grigory Nelyubov, a cosmonaut who had been considered a serious contender to be the first human in space before being dismissed from the program following a minor disciplinary incident. He had been erased from the photograph so completely that Western researchers did not know his name for years. He died in 1966, reportedly by suicide, still officially a non-person in Soviet space history. Valentin Bondarenko's image was removed from photographs so carefully that American researcher James Ober spent years tracking down a shadowy figure in cosmonaut group photographs he had labeled only as X7, not knowing the name, not knowing the story, before the 1986 Soviet article finally revealed who he was and what had happened to him. The Apollo 15 astronauts left a small sculpture on the moon's surface in 1971, a figure of a fallen astronaut, accompanied by a plaque listing 14 people who had died in the pursuit of space exploration, Americans and Soviets both. But Bondarenko's name was not on it. The cover-up was still holding. His name would not appear on any official memorial for another 15 years. Here is what the Soviet space program's history of secrecy actually cost. It cost the truth about 126 people who burned alive in the Kazakhstan desert on October 24, 1960, whose families were given cover stories and whose graves sat unmarked for nearly 3 decades. It cost Valentin Bondarenko the recognition he deserved as the first person to die in the pursuit of human spaceflight, a title he holds to this day, though his country denied it for 25 years. It may have cost Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee their lives, because the lesson their deaths taught about pure oxygen fires in spacecraft had already been paid for in full by a 24-year-old cosmonaut in Moscow 6 years earlier, and nobody outside the Soviet Union was allowed to know. And it cost Vladimir Komarov the honest account of his death, a man who climbed into a spacecraft he knew was not safe to protect his friend and died because institutional pressure overrode engineering judgment. The Soviet Union called him a hero and told half the story. After Glasnost opened the Soviet archives in the late 1980s, the impact of these revelations on Soviet citizens was seismic. By 1988, Soviet high school history exams had to be canceled. The revelations about the true history of the space program and dozens of other classified events had rendered the official textbooks so inaccurate that there was no point in testing students on their contents. The textbooks had been built on the same thing as the official space history, a version of events so carefully curated that it bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. We know most of this story now because the Soviet Union collapsed, because Gorbachev chose openness, because archives were declassified, and researchers like James Ober spent years tracking down the people who had been erased, cross-referencing photographs, interviewing survivors, comparing official records to eyewitness accounts. But every country that has ever pursued space exploration has made decisions it did not want the public to know about. Decisions driven by politics, by pressure, by the fear of what losing a race might mean. The Soviet Union's secrets came out eventually, as they always do. The question worth sitting with is not what they hid. It is what the pressure to hide it cost. In lives, in knowledge, in the 6 years between a fire in Moscow and a fire in Florida that might have been prevented by a single honest disclosure. Valentin Bondarenko was 24 years old. He had a wife named Anya and a son named Sasha. He was the youngest member of the first cosmonaut group. He was described as mild-mannered with a good singing voice. He died on March 23, 1961, 20 days before the flight that made Yuri Gagarin famous, and the world was not allowed to know his name for another 25 years.